Hello everyone, this is Leon. Before we start this tutorial, I just want to say thank you for tuning in. I hope you can learn something from me, and if you do, consider gives it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. It definitely helps with my channel growth. If you've done that, kindly leave a comment to let me know. Just know that you're awesome. As usual, the template link is in the description below, so feel free to check it out. After printing onto the papers, first is to cut along the dash line and connect them. After that, I'll usually glue them onto the harder cardstock. I often keep my templates for futures, so by doing so, it will be more durable than my wallet during the Black Friday sales. Next, I cut the blade template out because it will be the first part to do in this build. Then follow the middle line and cut it into half. After that, stack a piece of 2mm foam onto 5mm foam with contact adhesive. Be sure to use contact adhesive in well-ventilated area or use a respirator because it's bad for your health. To use it, just simply brush onto both sides of the foam and let it dry. Once the glue is dry, then proceed to stick both pieces together. This will be used for the main blade, so make sure it is enough for the front and back. After that, trace 2 copies of the template. And also trace the details onto the template. I recommend to mark all the details now so all the edges line can be used as glue reference guide. I first trace the golden crack line because I feel that might be easier. After the crack detail is done, I printed another set of the template and removed the gap line. Then trace onto the foam. After all the tracing are done, use a sharp razor knife to cut the foam out. Take note that for this middle line, have to do a slight slanted cut at roughly around 20 degrees inward. As for the sides, I also did inward slanted cut. As you can see over here, the slight slanted cut over at the middle. After that, use a super glue with a small dropper to glue at the very edge here. It might take a while to do, but the results are gonna be good. After that, let's move on to the handle. For the handle part, use 1cm foam and make 3 copies. But for 1 copy, we have to trace this middle part on. This part will be used for attaching the support structure, and I will show you later. Now, after cutting all the pieces out, I do not remove the middle piece yet, and then also trace onto another piece and use it as reference guide. Now use contact adhesive to stick one side to the middle piece first, then remove the middle part. Lastly, cover the other side. Now bring back the template and then remove the sanding guide on the template. Then mark the sanding guide on both sides of the handle. It will be used as a guide to round off the edges afterwards. Now use this little circle and mark the tip of the handle, and use it as a reference to keep the handles round. Now it is sanding time. I recommend using a Dremel or a rotary tool. Using a T grit sanding drum to remove most of the material first, then use a 240 grit sanding drum to smoothen the surface. As for the blade, also sand the edges to flatten it. This process will work better with a belt sander, but a Dremel works fine too. The point is to lower the angle even more, so when attaching both of the pieces together, it will be much flattened. After some sanding, it should look something like this. Also, please note that I did modify the sanding guide a little bit on the final template because I wanted the handle to be a little more rounded. Now look at the blade over here. This is what I mean to flatten it and make the angle much lower. Now let's move back to the blade. Before we attach the blade pieces together, let's enhance the tip with a wooden skewer. Use a razor knife, carefully cut a V-groove at the middle towards the tip. Repeat the same steps on the other side, so this will give space for the skewer to sit on. After that, use super glue to stick the skewer onto it. Next, I cut 2 straps with 2mm EVA foam and glue it to the end of the skewer. This will be used as the cushion to slot the metal support, so the skewer will fix in place and not moving around. Now we can finally start attaching the blade together. And first start with the tip. I use super glue for this process and then slowly walk on one side first. And then for the other side, I figures it will be easier to use contact adhesive, and I try to only apply at the edge, so the blade will look sharper that way. And here's another tip for getting better adhesion result, is to use the detail line at the edge of the both sides as a reference. The edge point have to match both sides so the foam will not over or under stretch. After attaching the blade pieces, it should look like this. And now it is time to add a metal support structure. Use a 1cm aluminum tube to slot into the blade. Put a handle underneath it, and then mark the cutting end, and cut it with a pipe cutter. After cutting it to length, I did a quick test just to make sure everything works fine. And here I almost forgot, but I also glued these edges together but not to the very end. Now let's attach the aluminum tube into the blade. I use Uhu glue for this process because it will give me more working time. I'd apply some into the tube for the skewer to fix in place, and then apply some onto the tube itself. Slot into the blade and try your best to find the spot for the skewer. Next, use the steel epoxy to fix the aluminum tube in place. To use steel epoxy, just simply mixing the two chemicals together at 1:1 ratio. Use a popsicle stick or skewer to mix it evenly and then apply onto the aluminum tube before slotting in. Epoxy has shorter working time compared to the Uhu glue, so be sure not to take too long for this process. Additionally, also use super glue to seal seams over here. Now that the main structure is done, it's time to carve the details. Use a razor knife to do a shallow cut along the golden details line. This process is essential because it will help with the painting process a lot. This process will take a while, and to avoid making the wrong cut, please keep checking with the reference photo before you make any cuts. After making sure all the cuts are done, use a heat gun set to highest heat and runs through the cutting line. This will open up the cutting line and makes it bigger. Please take note that don't hit on the sand spot for too long because it may toss the foam. Next is the reason why I layer the 2mm and 5mm foam for the blade. Now we need to make cuts for the gap line. What I did here is basically just make cuts for the stroke and remove the foam. For this step you have to make sure cut through the 2mm foam and keep the cut as accurate as possible. This will create a nice perpendicular groove rather than just making a V-groove. And since we use contact adhesive to layer the foam, so you might feel some resistance when removing the foam. But with a little bit of heat from the heat gun, it will be able to soften the contact adhesive and makes it easier to remove. This process is gonna be long, so just be patient and do it slowly. The result is going to be promising. After finishing this gap, let's move on to the next step. Now let's make the details on the guard. First thing to do is to mark all the line over here on both sides of the sword. I've marked all the corresponding thickness on the parts, so it will be easier to refer. Now carefully remove all the details part out and mark them onto the blade. After that, use the corresponding thickness foam to make the details. Some technique I use here is doing an inward slanted cut, so when flip over, they will have some angle on the edges. This will make the parts look more interesting rather than just a flat piece of detail. Additionally, you can also use a rotary tool to round off the edges. Continue to work on the rest of the details with the corresponding thickness. When it comes to the bigger piece like this, note that I mark a dash line on the template. This will indicate the sanding line. So after making copies on the foam, we have to sand down with rotary tool afterwards. Continue the rest with basically the same method. Then fix the detail parts onto the blade guard with super glue. After all the details are added onto the blade guard, it shall look like this. After the sword guard detail is done, let's move on to this detail. Just like other details, I also stated the corresponding thickness for the better reference. All you have to do is to just trace on the corresponding thickness foam and cut them out. Only thing to take note is just this golden part is kind of wrong. Apparently the middle part is not hollow and I already fixed it in the final template. To add more dimensions on the details, I also recommend doing some inward slanted cut and flip it over. This will make the whole thing pop and looks much better. But only thing to take note is, the edge that connects the other side will have to be slanted cut outwards. As for this piece, after making copies on the foam and flip it over, I then remove the inner details on the template and use it as a reference and then carve it with sharp razor knife. It might take a while to do this, so please be patient and be really careful. After some times of cutting and gluing, and it should look like this. Except the golden detail is not supposed to be hollow. We are still not done yet, so let's move on to the handle. At this part, it may or may not need to do modification on the template, as I have already included in the final template. But first, let's start from adding the attachment guides on the handle. Next, I trace the template on the cardstock, try to manually add on the side. It will take a few trial and error to get the final piece. All I did here is just freehand estimating and draw, cut it out, place on the sword handle and see if it matched the shape. And after a few trial and error, I finally got the perfect one. Make 2 copies on a 3mm foam, and then attach it onto the sword. After that, continue with the other details. The flat one is simple, just add on like usual would do. As for the oval over here, after tracing the line, I only did a shallow cut and we hit up with a heat gun afterwards to make the line visible. After that, continue the rest of the details with basically the same method to finish the rest of the details. Next will be the tip. It is also the same. Mark the guiding line, make a new template, make copies on foam, and fix it in place. The only small detail I did here is I made an offset attachment by lifting up the pointy part a little bit. After that, continue adding on the detail. For this small detail over here, basically just stick the bigger piece first and then layer the smaller one on top will do. Other than that, I did also center the tip a little bit just to smoothen the seams. Now last but not least is the little circles over here. Make one copy it and only the bigger one we have to manually draw a circle at one side. It will be used as the reference because the end is not really a pointy one. And round it off with a rotary tool. After that, fix it on with super glue and the sword base is done. Now is the important step before painting the sword. Foam has tiny holes so heat sealing can melt and close the tiny pore. Turns the heat gun to the highest heat and then heat the sword thoroughly. Please take note that heating the same spot for too long will burn the foam, and also be extremely careful when using a heat gun. After that, we'll be priming the foam. Just like I mentioned before, foam has tiny pores, so priming it will be able to seal the foam and let the paints to sit on better. I use spray gun to prime with other base paints. It requires an air compressor to operate, so if you don't have access to it, you can simply use PVA glue or white glue. After priming, the first color I painted is silver and metallic red. After that, using a 3M masking tape, cover the tiny red part close to the sword guard. Then paint the blade with dark silver. The reason I use dark silver is because I want to make some contrast between the dark silver and black. Next, use a 2-inch masking tape to cover the entire blade. This is to cover all the dark silver and prepare to paint the next color. At this step, remember the shallow cuts we made earlier. After tapping the masking tape, the cuts will be used as a guide to follow through. Use a razor knife to cut along and remove the masking tape afterwards. After that, I decide to paint this part first before the golden part, because it can be covered up easily. Repeat the process, but remember to leave the paint to fully dry, because the undried paint will leave sticky residue after being covered by masking tape. Once everything is painted, it is time for Christmas unboxing day. Remove all the masking tape and pray to every super being, and hope everything is fine. Once make sure everything is good, there are still some work left to do. I use Liquitex Heavy Body Mask Black to paint all the remaining black color parts. But here you will see the reason why I use dark silver, so the black color will have a better contrast. I only use a small flat brush and paints all the gaps and the guard. After that, to give it more dimensions, I also water down the paint and then paint it to a corner to add some shapes. This will make everything pulse much better and makes everything more solid. And the good thing about painting acrylic over aerosol paint is, the acrylic can be wiped off easily if you made a mistake. And once everything is painted, then it is done.